So I thought I was living the dream when I married Sarah 3 months ago. We had the perfect church wedding with Pastor Williams officiating, surrounded by family and friends. Everything seemed picture perfect until I started noticing things that didn't add up. The way they looked at each other during the ceremony, her mysterious disappearances, the defensive attitude whenever I asked simple questions. I'm usually pretty trusting, but something felt off. Then I found evidence that completely shattered my world. What I discovered about my new wife and our pastor made me realize that my wedding day wasn't the beginning of my happily ever after. It was the day I got played by two people I trusted most. The betrayal ran deeper than I ever imagined, and when I finally exposed the truth, it destroyed more than just my marriage. So I'm Daniel, 29, office worker. I spend most of my days in a cubicle doing data analysis for a mid-sized insurance company. Pretty boring stuff, but it pays the bills, and I actually like the routine. I'm the kind of guy who keeps his head down, does his work, and tries to stay out of office drama. My coworkers would probably describe me as quiet, but reliable. I met Sarah about 2 years ago through mutual friends at a barbecue. She was this bubbly, outgoing woman who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. We hit it off immediately and started dating pretty seriously within a few months. She was everything I thought I wanted in a partner. Funny, caring, beautiful, and she seemed to really get me despite my more reserved personality. We got engaged last Christmas after I proposed during a weekend trip to the mountains. Sarah was over the moon and immediately started planning our dream wedding. She wanted everything to be perfect, and honestly, I was happy to let her take the lead on most of the details. I figured marriage planning was more her thing anyway. The one thing we both agreed on was having Pastor Williams officiate our ceremony. He'd been at Community Baptist Church for about 5 years and had this warm, charismatic personality that everyone loved. Sarah had started attending his Bible study group a few months after we got engaged, and she always came home talking about how inspiring his teachings were. I went with her a few times and thought he seemed like a good guy, mid-40s, married with kids, the whole respectable pastor image. Looking back now, I realized there were probably signs I missed. But when you're in love and planning a wedding, you tend to see what you want to see. The morning of our wedding day started perfectly. I woke up in my buddy Mike's guest room feeling nervous, but excited. We'd done the whole traditional thing where Sarah and I didn't see each other the night before, so I was looking forward to that moment when she'd walk down the aisle. I got to the church early to help with last-minute setup. Community Baptist wasn't huge, but it had this classic charm with beautiful stained glass windows and wooden pews that could seat about 150 people. Sarah had decorated everything with white roses and baby's breath, and honestly, it looked like something out of a magazine. Pastor Williams was already there when I arrived, dressed in his formal robes and greeting early guests. He came over and shook my hand, telling me how happy he was to be officiating our special day. I thanked him and mentioned how much Sarah appreciated his guidance during their Bible study sessions. Something flickered across his face when I said that, but he just smiled and said she was a wonderful woman. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 p.m., and by 1:30, the church was filling up with family and friends. My parents had driven in from 3 states away, and Sarah's whole extended family was there. Everyone seemed excited and happy, taking photos and catching up. When the music started and Sarah appeared at the back of the church, I felt that rush of emotion you're supposed to feel on your wedding day. She looked absolutely stunning in her dress, and her smile was radiant as she walked down the aisle with her father. For a moment, everything felt perfect and right. But then I started noticing things during the ceremony itself. When Pastor Williams was speaking about the sacred bond of marriage, he kept making eye contact with Sarah in a way that seemed more intense than necessary. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but it happened multiple times. Sarah would look back at him with this soft expression that I'd never seen her give me. During the part where we exchanged vows, I caught them sharing what looked like a private moment. Pastor Williams was supposed to be looking at both of us as we spoke, but his attention seemed focused entirely on Sarah. She was looking directly at him instead of me while she recited her vows about faithfulness and devotion. The ring exchange felt awkward too. When Pastor Williams handed Sarah my ring to place on my finger, their hands touched for longer than necessary. Sarah actually blushed, and Pastor Williams cleared his throat before continuing with the ceremony. I tried to shake off these observations and focus on the fact that I was getting married to the woman I loved. Maybe I was just being paranoid because of wedding day nerves. But when Pastor Williams pronounced us husband and wife and told me to kiss my bride, I noticed he was watching us with this strange expression that I couldn't quite read. The rest of the ceremony went smoothly, and everyone cheered as we walked back down the aisle as a married couple. During the receiving line afterward, Pastor Williams congratulated us both, but when he hugged Sarah, it lasted noticeably longer than his handshake with me. Sarah seemed flustered afterward, and when I asked if she was okay, she just said she was overwhelmed with happiness. As we were taking photos outside the church, I saw Pastor Williams and Sarah talking privately near the side entrance. They were standing closer than seemed appropriate, and Sarah was laughing at something he'd said. When they noticed me looking, they quickly separated, and Sarah came over to join the family photos. I pushed down my concerns and told myself I was being ridiculous. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and I wasn't going to let paranoid thoughts ruin it. But those looks they'd exchanged during the ceremony kept replaying in my mind as we headed to the reception venue. The reception was at the Riverside Country Club, a place Sarah had insisted on despite the cost. She'd said it was important to have our celebration somewhere elegant and memorable. The venue was beautiful, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course and a dance floor that could accommodate all our guests. Everything started off great. The cocktail hour was lively, with everyone mingling and enjoying the open bar. Sarah looked radiant as she worked the room, hugging relatives and posing for photos. I felt proud watching her charm everyone with her personality and grace. During dinner, I gave my speech thanking everyone for coming and talking about how lucky I felt to have found Sarah. She teared up and squeezed my hand, and for a moment, all my earlier concerns seemed silly. This was my wife, and we were surrounded by people who loved us. But about an hour into the reception, Sarah disappeared. I was talking with my college buddies when I realized I hadn't seen her in a while. I asked her maid of honor, Jessica, if she knew where Sarah had gone, and Jessica said she thought Sarah had stepped outside to get some air. I went looking for her, but couldn't find her anywhere on the patio or in the gardens. When I asked the venue staff, they said they hadn't seen her either. I started to worry that maybe she was feeling sick or overwhelmed, so I checked the ladies' room and even asked Jessica to look for her. After about 30 minutes, Sarah reappeared looking slightly disheveled. Her hair was a bit messy, and her lipstick had been reapplied, but not quite perfectly. When I asked where she'd been, she said she'd needed some quiet time and had been walking around the grounds to clear her head. I accepted her explanation, but something felt off about her demeanor. She seemed distracted and kept checking her phone throughout the rest of the evening. During our first dance, she kept looking over my shoulder at something, and when I turned to see what she was looking at, I didn't notice anything unusual. Later that night, while Sarah was in the bathroom getting ready for bed at our hotel, I saw her phone light up with a text message on the nightstand. I normally would never look at her phone, but something made me glance at the notification. The message was from a contact labeled, and the preview showed part of the message that made my stomach drop. The text said something about tonight being perfect and thanking her for the special moment they'd shared. It was flirty and intimate in a way that definitely wasn't appropriate for a pastor to be sending to a newly married woman. I tried to see more of the message, but Sarah came out of the bathroom before I could read the full thing. I pretended to be looking at something else and didn't say anything, but my mind was racing. PW had to be Pastor Williams. Those were his initials. What special moment were they talking about? Is that where Sarah had been during her disappearance at the reception? Sarah seemed unusually quiet as we got ready for bed. When I tried to initiate intimacy on our wedding night, she said she was exhausted and just wanted to sleep. I understood that weddings are tiring, but it felt like rejection after an already confusing day. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what I'd observed. The looks during the ceremony, Sarah's disappearance, the flirty text message, it all seemed to point to something I didn't want to believe. But I also knew I could be completely wrong and letting my imagination run wild. I decided I needed to pay closer attention and see if there were other signs I'd been missing. If something was really going on between my wife and our pastor, I needed to know the truth, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The next morning, Sarah seemed back to her normal, cheerful self, talking excitedly about our honeymoon plans and showing me photos from the wedding that guests had already posted on social media. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, and I was determined to figure out what it was. We got back from our honeymoon in Hawaii a week later, and I was hoping that some time alone together would help me forget about my suspicions. The trip had been nice, but Sarah seemed distracted even in paradise. She spent a lot of time on her phone, claiming she was just sharing photos with friends and family. The morning after we returned home, I decided to unpack while Sarah was in the shower. I was putting her clothes away when I found something in her purse that made my blood run cold. There was a hotel receipt from the Marriott downtown, dated the day of our wedding, with a checkout time of 6 p.m. I stared at the receipt, trying to make sense of it. The Marriott was about 10 minutes from our reception venue. The checkout time meant someone had been there during the exact window when Sarah had disappeared from our reception. The room was registered under the name. My hands were shaking as I took a photo of the receipt with my phone before putting it back where I found it. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was evidence that something had happened between Sarah and Pastor Williams on our wedding day. When Sarah came out of the shower, I tried to act normal, but I felt like my world was crumbling. I asked her casually if she'd enjoyed the reception, and she gave me the same story about needing air and walking around the grounds. I wanted to confront her about the receipt right then, but something held me back. Maybe I needed more proof before I accused my wife of cheating on our wedding day. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to Sarah's behavior. She was definitely more secretive with her phone, taking it with her to the bathroom and keeping it face down when we were together. She also seemed less interested in physical intimacy, claiming she was tired or stressed from getting back into her work routine. I tried bringing up Pastor Williams in casual conversation to see how she'd react. When I mentioned that we should write him a thank you note for officiating our wedding, Sarah got flustered and said she'd already taken care of it. When I asked what she'd written, she gave a vague answer about thanking him for making our day special. On Thursday evening, I decided to test my suspicions. I told Sarah I was going to work late to catch up on things I'd missed during our honeymoon. Instead, I parked down the street from our house and waited to see what she'd do. Around 8 p.m., Sarah left the house dressed up in a way that seemed excessive for wherever she claimed to be going. She'd told me earlier that she was having dinner with her sister, but when I called her sister later to ask about something unrelated, her sister mentioned that she was at home with her kids and hadn't seen Sarah in weeks. I felt sick realizing that Sarah was lying to me and probably meeting Pastor Williams. When she came home around 11 p.m., she seemed guilty and nervous. She said dinner had run late, and that her sister had been going through some relationship problems that they'd talked about for hours. The next morning, I confronted Sarah more directly. I told her I'd noticed she seemed distant since we got back from our honeymoon, and I asked if everything was okay between us. She immediately got defensive, saying I was being paranoid and that marriage was an adjustment for both of us. When I pressed further and mentioned that I felt like she was hiding something, Sarah became angry. She accused me of not trusting her, and said that if I was going to be suspicious and controlling, maybe we'd made a mistake getting married. Her reaction was so extreme that it confirmed my worst fears. I realized I needed concrete proof before I could confront her about the affair. The hotel receipt was suspicious, but she could potentially explain it away. I needed something undeniable that would force her to tell me the truth about what was happening with Pastor Williams. That night, I made a decision that felt terrible but necessary. I was going to find a way to catch them together or get evidence of their communication. I hated feeling like I had to spy on my own wife, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty and lies anymore. I decided to visit Pastor Williams at the church to see if I could get a read on him directly. I called the church office on Tuesday morning and asked if I could schedule a meeting to discuss some questions about married life. The secretary said Pastor Williams had an opening that afternoon at 3 p.m. Community Baptist Church felt different when I walked in that day. The same building where I'd gotten married just 2 weeks earlier now felt ominous and unwelcoming. I found Pastor Williams in his office, which was decorated with family photos and religious artwork. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me and asked how married life was treating me. I started by thanking him again for officiating our wedding and telling him how much it meant to have someone we trusted guide us through the ceremony. He smiled and said it had been his pleasure, adding that Sarah was a very special woman. The way he said her name made my skin crawl. I mentioned that Sarah had been attending his Bible study group regularly and asked if he thought that was helping her spiritual growth. Pastor Williams got this look in his eyes that I can only describe as possessive when he talked about Sarah's dedication to studying Scripture and how much progress she'd made under his guidance. I tried to probe more subtly by asking if he'd noticed any changes in Sarah since our wedding. I said she seemed different somehow, and I wondered if marriage was affecting her spiritually. Pastor Williams assured me that transitions like marriage could be challenging, but that Sarah was handling everything very well. When I mentioned that Sarah seemed to be spending more time at church activities lately, Pastor Williams said that was wonderful and that spiritual growth required dedication. He suggested that maybe I should consider joining more church activities myself to support my wife's journey. The whole conversation felt like he was playing some kind of game with me. He never said anything directly inappropriate, but there was this underlying smugness in his tone that made me want to punch him. I left the meeting feeling more convinced than ever that something was going on. That evening, I told Sarah about my meeting with Pastor Williams. She seemed surprised and asked why I'd felt the need to talk to him. When I said I was just trying to be a better husband and support her spiritual interests, she relaxed but still seemed uncomfortable with the idea. On Thursday, I decided to take a more direct approach. I drove to the church around the time Sarah's Bible study group was supposed to end, planning to surprise her with dinner plans. When I got there, I saw Sarah's car in the parking lot, but the other cars that were usually there for group meetings were gone. I waited in my car for about 20 minutes, watching the building. Finally, I saw Sarah and Pastor Williams come out of a side entrance together. They were walking very close to each other, and Pastor Williams had his hand on Sarah's lower back in a way that was definitely not appropriate for a pastor and a married parishioner. They talked for a few more minutes by Sarah's car before she got in and drove away. Pastor Williams watched her leave with this satisfied expression on his face that made me feel physically ill. When Sarah got home an hour later, I asked how Bible study had gone. She said it was good and that they'd had a great discussion about forgiveness and redemption. When I asked if it had run late, she said they'd finished right on time, but that she'd stopped at the grocery store afterward. I knew she was lying because I'd followed her route home, and she'd driven straight from the church. The lies were getting more frequent and more brazen, and I was starting to feel like I didn't know my wife at all. That night, I made a decision that would either save my marriage or end it. I was going to find a way to record one of their meetings and get proof of what was really happening between them. I couldn't confront Sarah with just suspicions and circumstantial evidence. I needed something undeniable. I spent the next day researching recording apps for my phone and figuring out how I could position myself to overhear their conversations. It felt terrible to be planning to spy on my wife, but I was desperate for the truth. By Friday, I was a mess. I'd barely slept all week, and my coworkers were starting to notice that something was wrong. I kept making mistakes on simple tasks and spacing out during meetings. Mike, my best man, called me during lunch to check in and see how married life was going. I almost broke down and told him everything right there in the office cafeteria. Instead, I just said that marriage was harder than I'd expected and that Sarah and I were having some adjustment issues. Mike said that was totally normal and that he and his wife had gone through a rough patch in their first year too. When I got home that evening, Sarah was getting ready to go out again. She said she was meeting some friends from work for drinks and that she'd be home by 10 p.m. I asked if I could come along, but she said it was just going to be girl talk and that I'd be bored. After she left, I called my sister Emma, who lives about an hour away. Emma has always been good at reading people and situations, and I desperately needed someone to talk to. I drove to her place and ended up spilling everything. The weird looks during the wedding, the hotel receipt, the lies about where she was going. Emma listened without judgment and then asked me what I wanted to do about it. I told her I was planning to try to record Sarah and Pastor Williams together to get proof of their affair. Emma was quiet for a long time before she said that if I was right about what was happening, I deserved to know the truth. She also pointed out that if Sarah was cheating with Pastor Williams, it wasn't just about my marriage. He was in a position of authority and trust in the community, and people had a right to know what kind of person he really was. That perspective helped me feel less guilty about what I was planning to do. Emma offered to help however she could, and said I could stay with her if I needed somewhere to go after I confronted Sarah. Having her support made me feel less alone in this nightmare situation. On Saturday morning, I put my plan into action. I downloaded a recording app on my phone and figured out how to activate it quickly and discreetly. Sarah had mentioned that she was going to help with some church preparation work that afternoon, which I now suspected was code for meeting Pastor Williams. I followed her to the church and parked where I could see the building, but hopefully wouldn't be noticed. Sarah went inside through the main entrance, and about 10 minutes later, Pastor Williams arrived and went in through the same door. I waited another few minutes and then approached the building. I knew from attending services that Pastor Williams's office was near a window that faced the parking lot. I positioned myself outside that window, hoping I could hear their conversation through the glass. At first, I could only make out muffled voices, but then they moved closer to the window, and I could hear them clearly. What I heard made me want to vomit. Pastor Williams was telling Sarah how much he'd missed her and how difficult it was to pretend they were just pastor and parishioner when other people were around. Sarah was responding in a voice I'd never heard her use with me, soft and flirtatious. She told him that she'd been thinking about their time together at the hotel on our wedding day and how perfect it had been. Pastor Williams said something about how they deserved to be together and that he was tired of hiding their relationship. I managed to record about 10 minutes of their conversation, including Pastor Williams saying that he was considering leaving his wife and the church so they could be together openly. Sarah said she wasn't ready to leave me yet because it would be too complicated, but that she loved him and wanted to find a way to make it work. The recording was everything I needed to prove that my wife had been cheating on me with our pastor, including on our wedding day. I felt vindicated but also completely destroyed. Hearing Sarah talk about loving another man and planning a future with him was more painful than I'd expected. I drove back to Emma's house and played the recording for her. She was shocked and angry on my behalf, and she helped me figure out what to do next. We decided that I needed to confront them both publicly so they couldn't deny it or try to gaslight me into thinking I was imagining things. Emma helped me plan the confrontation for the following Sunday. Community Baptist had a monthly congregational meeting after the regular service where they discussed church business and upcoming events. It would be the perfect opportunity to address the entire community about what their pastor had been doing. I spent Saturday night at Emma's house, barely sleeping and going over what I was going to say. Part of me hoped that somehow I was wrong about everything, but the recording made it impossible to deny what was happening. Sunday morning, I drove to church alone. Sarah had asked why I wasn't riding with her, and I'd made up some excuse about running errands afterward. She seemed relieved that I wasn't going to be sitting with her, which should have been another red flag if I'd needed one. The service felt surreal. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about honesty and integrity in relationships, while Sarah sat in her usual spot in the third pew, nodding along like she was absorbing every word of wisdom. I sat in the back, watching them and feeling sick about what I was about to do. After the service, about 50 people stayed for the congregational meeting. The church board members sat at a table in front, while everyone else took seats in the pews. Pastor Williams was leading the meeting, discussing budget items and upcoming community events. When they opened the floor for new business, I stood up. My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to go through with it. I said I had something important to share with the congregation about a matter that affected all of us. Pastor Williams looked surprised, but nodded for me to continue. Sarah was staring at me with a confused expression, probably wondering what I was doing there and why I looked so serious. I started by saying that I'd discovered something that had shattered my faith in people I'd trusted most. I explained that I'd found evidence of an inappropriate relationship between Pastor Williams and my wife Sarah, including an affair that had been going on during our engagement and had continued after our wedding. The reaction was immediate and intense. People started murmuring and looking back and forth between Pastor Williams, Sarah, and me. Sarah's face went completely white, and Pastor Williams started to stand up, probably to deny everything. Before he could speak, I pulled out my phone and said I had recorded evidence of their relationship. Pastor Williams immediately started protesting, saying that I was obviously having some kind of mental breakdown and that my accusations were completely false. Sarah finally found her voice and said that I was being ridiculous and that she couldn't believe I was embarrassing her like this in front of the whole church. She said I was obviously jealous of her spiritual growth and was trying to sabotage her relationship with her pastor. That's when I played the recording. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough that everyone could hear Pastor Williams and Sarah talking about their love for each other, their time at the hotel on my wedding day, and their plans for the future. The silence in that church was deafening. You could hear people breathing and shifting in their seats, but no one said a word for what felt like an eternity. Sarah was crying, and Pastor Williams looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Finally, Mrs. Henderson, one of the longtime church members, stood up and said that this was the most disgraceful thing she'd ever witnessed. She said that Pastor Williams had violated his sacred trust and that Sarah had made a mockery of the institution of marriage. Other people started speaking up, some defending Pastor Williams and saying there must be some explanation, others expressing shock and disappointment. The meeting quickly devolved into chaos, with people arguing and taking sides. Pastor Williams finally tried to regain control by saying that the recording was taken out of context and that he and Sarah had simply been discussing her spiritual struggles in her new marriage. But the evidence was too clear, and most people weren't buying his explanation. Sarah ran out of the church crying, and several people followed her. Pastor Williams tried to continue the meeting, but Mrs. Henderson and a few other board members said they needed to discuss his future with the church immediately. I left during all the commotion, feeling emotionally drained, but also relieved that the truth was finally out there. I knew there would be consequences and fallout, but at least I didn't have to carry the burden of their deception alone anymore. The aftermath of the church confrontation was immediate and intense. By Sunday evening, my phone was buzzing constantly with calls and texts from people who'd been at the meeting. Some were supportive and sympathetic, while others accused me of handling the situation poorly and causing unnecessary drama. Emma came to stay with me that night because I didn't want to be alone. Sarah had been blowing up my phone with calls and texts, alternating between anger and desperate apologies. She kept saying that I'd misunderstood what I'd heard and that she could explain everything if I'd just talked to her. Pastor Williams had apparently been suspended from his duties pending an investigation by the church board. According to the messages I was getting, his wife had left town with their kids to stay with her parents, and there were rumors that she was filing for divorce. On Monday, I took the day off work because I couldn't concentrate on anything. Sarah came by the house while I was there, and we had the most difficult conversation of my life. She finally admitted to the affair but tried to minimize it, saying it had been a mistake and that she'd been confused about her feelings. When I confronted her about the hotel receipt and the fact that she'd been with Pastor Williams on our wedding day, she broke down completely. She said she knew it was wrong, but that she'd felt trapped and didn't know how to end things with him before the wedding. I asked her how long the affair had been going on, and she admitted it had started about 6 months before our wedding. She said Pastor Williams had been counseling her about pre-marriage anxiety, and their relationship had gradually become inappropriate and then physical. The betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined. She'd been cheating on me during our entire engagement, planning our wedding while sleeping with another man. She'd stood in front of our families and friends and promised to be faithful while already breaking that promise. Sarah begged me to go to counseling with her and said she was willing to do anything to save our marriage. She claimed that she loved me and that Pastor Williams had manipulated her during a vulnerable time. But I couldn't see how we could ever come back from this level of deception. On Tuesday, I met with a divorce attorney that Emma had recommended. The lawyer said I had grounds for an annulment based on fraud, since Sarah had concealed a material fact about her fidelity during our engagement. The process would be quicker and cleaner than a traditional divorce. Meanwhile, the situation at Community Baptist was getting messy. The church board had voted to terminate Pastor Williams, but he was fighting the decision and claiming that I'd violated his privacy by recording him without consent. Some members of the congregation were supporting him and saying the church was overreacting. Mrs. Henderson called me on Wednesday to ask if I'd be willing to speak to the board about what I'd discovered. She said they were trying to get a complete picture of Pastor Williams's conduct and wanted to make sure they handled the situation appropriately. I agreed to meet with them, mostly because I wanted to make sure Pastor Williams couldn't manipulate his way back into a position of trust. When I sat down with the 5 board members, I shared everything I'd discovered, including the timeline of the affair and the evidence I'd gathered. The board members were clearly disturbed by what they heard. One of them mentioned that they'd received calls from other women in the congregation who were now questioning whether Pastor Williams had been inappropriate with them as well. It seemed like my situation might not have been an isolated incident. By the end of the week, Pastor Williams had resigned from his position rather than face a formal investigation. Sarah had moved out of our house and was staying with her parents. The whole situation had become the biggest scandal in our small community's recent memory. I felt vindicated but also exhausted from all the drama and attention. All I'd wanted was to know the truth about my wife's behavior, and now my personal life was the subject of gossip and speculation throughout the entire town. 3 weeks after the church confrontation, I was starting to adjust to my new reality as a soon-to-be divorced man. The annulment paperwork was moving through the system, and Sarah had agreed not to contest it. She'd been staying with her parents and had apparently started seeing a therapist to deal with what she called her. The hardest part wasn't the legal stuff or even the gossip around town. It was the crushing loneliness and the way this whole experience had changed how I viewed relationships and trust. I found myself questioning every interaction I'd had with Sarah, wondering what had been real and what had been manipulation. My work performance had improved once I wasn't constantly distracted by suspicions and lies, but I was struggling with depression and anger. Some days I felt relieved to be free of the deception, and other days I felt like a complete failure for not seeing the signs earlier. Emma had been incredible throughout the whole ordeal, checking on me regularly and helping me navigate practical things like separating finances and deciding what to do with wedding gifts. She kept reminding me that none of this was my fault and that I'd handled the terrible situation with more grace than most people would have managed. The community reaction had been mixed, but was gradually settling into a pattern. Most people seemed to understand that I'd been the victim in the situation, but there were still some who thought I should have handled things privately instead of exposing everyone publicly. I try not to care about those opinions, but it was hard not to feel judged. Pastor Williams had left town entirely, and I'd heard through the grapevine that his wife was indeed filing for divorce. Community Baptist had brought in an interim pastor while they searched for a permanent replacement, and attendance had dropped significantly as people struggled with their faith after the scandal. Sarah had tried to reach out to me several times, usually late at night, when she was probably drinking. Her messages ranged from angry accusations that I destroyed her life to tearful apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I'd stopped responding to any of them on my lawyer's advice. One evening in early November, I was at home trying to distract myself with a movie when someone knocked on my door. It was Jessica, Sarah's former maid of honor, who I hadn't spoken to since the wedding. She looked nervous and said she had something she needed to tell me. Jessica came inside and explained that she'd known about Sarah's affair with Pastor Williams for months before our wedding. Sarah had confided in her and made her promise not to tell me, saying she was going to end things with Pastor Williams after we got married. I felt a new wave of anger and betrayal hearing this. Jessica said she'd been torn about what to do and had tried to convince Sarah to tell me the truth, but Sarah had insisted she could handle the situation herself. Jessica apologized profusely for not warning me and said she'd been feeling guilty ever since the truth came out. While I appreciated Jessica finally being honest with me, it was painful to realize that other people had known about my wife's infidelity and had chosen to protect her instead of me. It made me wonder how many other people had been aware of what was happening and had said nothing. That night, I called Emma and told her about Jessica's visit. Emma was furious on my behalf and said it proved that I'd been surrounded by people who didn't have my best interests at heart. She reminded me that I was better off without all of them and that I deserved people in my life who would be honest and loyal. I was starting to believe her, but the process of rebuilding my ability to trust was going to take time. For now, I was focused on getting through each day and trying to figure out what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. 6 months after the annulment was finalized, I was in a much better place mentally and emotionally. I'd started seeing a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma, and the sessions were helping me work through the anger and trust issues that had developed after discovering Sarah's affair. I'd also made some significant changes in my life. I'd gotten a promotion at work that came with more responsibility and better pay, and I'd started taking evening classes to finish the MBA I'd put on hold when Sarah and I got engaged. Staying busy with productive activities was helping me rebuild my sense of purpose and self-worth. The social fallout from the church scandal had mostly died down, though I still occasionally ran into people who wanted to rehash the whole situation. I'd learned to politely change the subject or excuse myself from those conversations. Most people had moved on to newer gossip, and the whole thing was becoming old news. Community Baptist had hired a new pastor, a woman in her 50s who was reportedly doing a good job of healing the congregation and restoring trust in the church leadership. I hadn't been back to any services, but Emma had visited once and said the atmosphere was much healthier than it had been under Pastor Williams. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Sarah was still living with her parents and had been struggling with depression and anxiety since our marriage ended. Part of me felt sorry for her, but mostly I felt grateful that I'd discovered the truth when I did rather than wasting years in a fraudulent relationship. Pastor Williams had apparently moved to another state and was working in some kind of sales job. His ex-wife had remarried and seemed to be doing well with their children. I was glad that his family had been able to move on from the damage he'd caused. The biggest challenge I was still facing was learning to trust my instincts in relationships. My therapist said it was normal to second-guess myself after being deceived so thoroughly, but that I needed to remember that I had actually picked up on the signs that something was wrong. The problem hadn't been my perception. It had been that I'd ignored my gut feelings because I wanted to believe the best about people I loved. I'd started dating again, very casually, and had met a few women who seemed genuine and straightforward. I wasn't ready for anything serious, but it was encouraging to have normal conversations with people who didn't seem to be hiding anything from me. One evening in late spring, I was having dinner with a woman named Lisa who worked in marketing at a company across town. She was telling me about her recent divorce and how difficult it had been to rebuild her life afterward. As she spoke, I realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't sitting across the table analyzing every word, looking for hidden meanings, or waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was just listening, and it felt normal. That in itself was a kind of victory. After dinner, we walked out into the cool night air, and Lisa said something that stuck with me. You don't have to let what happened define you. It's part of your story, but it doesn't have to be the whole thing. For some reason, hearing that from someone who'd also been broken and rebuilt herself carried more weight than anything my therapist had said. When I got home, I sat in the quiet of my living room and thought about how far I'd come since that disastrous wedding day. 6 months ago, I was humiliated in front of my entire community, stripped of the future I thought I had, and questioning my own worth. Now, I had my career on track, I was working toward my MBA, and I was finally beginning to let people back into my life. Sarah's betrayal and Pastor Williams's hypocrisy had nearly destroyed me, but they also forced me to rebuild from the ground up. I'd learned that ignoring red flags doesn't make them disappear, that trust is something you give carefully, and that no matter how badly someone tries to break you, you can still choose how the story ends. For me, it ended not in bitterness, but in growth. I didn't get the happily ever after I imagined when I walked down the aisle, but I got something more valuable: clarity, resilience, and the freedom to write my own future without lies holding me down. And as strange as it sounds, I was grateful. Because sometimes the worst day of your life is the one that sets you free. If you've ever gone through something like this, you know how hard it is to rebuild. But trust me, it is possible. And maybe my story made you think about your own life, or about someone you know who's been through betrayal. If it did, stay with us for more stories like this one. You're not alone. And sometimes, hearing how others got through it is the reminder you need that you can too.